In the primordial dark, when no Terran charted the stars, and no Protoss sang to the void, a new hunger woke in fire. At the galactic core burned Xeris, a volcanic crucible, veiled in ash storms, rivers of magma, and skies that thundered with incandescent stone. Into this furnace, the ancient Xel'Naga cast the seeds of life, not in benevolence, but in design. They sought what they called purity of essence, a life form that would not ossify into perfection, but sharpen itself ceaselessly through trial, predation, and change. From their distant worldships, they watched Xeris boil and waited. From a bubbling mire, they would later name the first spawning pool. A slick of living potential, split and split again, dividing into voracious moths that recognized nothing but appetite. The earliest Zerg were larval things, small, quick, and relentless, blind to anything but the scent of stronger flesh. They burrowed into hosts larger than themselves, hitching a ride within muscle and marrow, tasting nerves, learning patterns. What they survived, they imitated. What they imitated, they became. The law was simple: consume, adapt, persist. In the slaughterhouse dawns of Xeris, 1,000 lineages ended with each sunrise, and a handful endured. Harder, leaner, hungrier. Xeris itself was an executioner. Volcanoes erupted without warning. Rain seared the ground with caustic chemicals, and predators stalked with armor plated by natural catastrophe. To live here demanded more than tooth and claw. It demanded the willingness to become other than oneself. The larval Zerg delighted in that heresy. They drank traits as if they were water, spines for striking, chitin for withstanding, sensory fronds to taste electromagnetic whispers, lungs remade into filters, filters remade into gills, gills remade into vents to bleed heat into ash. Evolution. Elsewhere a slow river, here became a cataract. The Zerg leapt from form to form, discarding weakness like shed skin. Above, in the hush of orbit, the Xel'Naga studied their work. They had once shepherded the Protoss toward purity of form, a pinnacle of structure and potential. But unity slipped through those children's fingers, and pride cut deeper than any blade. Now, chastened and divided among themselves, the Xel'Naga turned to Xeris and to essence. Some warned that to cherish raw becoming was to invite a hunger even gods could not leash. Others, led by the heretic vision of Amon, insisted that form and essence could be fused, that a perfect synthesis might shatter the endless cycle of rise and ruin. On Xeris, the argument took on flesh, subtle adjustments, barely nudges by the measure of such ancients, encouraged what was already inevitable. The Zerg learned not only to borrow traits, but to weave them, to bind foreign strengths into a coherent whole. Are you strong? Become stronger by devouring strength. Are you swift? Become swifter by outracing extinction. Are you many? Become one. The planet's biosphere bent under the pressure. Species that had reigned for millennia vanished inside the Zerg's ascending spiral, their finest adaptations suborned to a greater will that had not yet found its voice. That voice gathered first as a pressure at the edge of hearing, a murmur braided from 1,000 instincts, a cumulative leaning of the entire swarm toward purpose. The Xel'Naga knew the peril of ungoverned multiplicity. They had seen how individuality without harmony had shattered an empire of light. So they engineered a center, an anchor to the storm. Deep below Xerxes' broken crust, currents of psionic potential condensed around an embryonic intelligence. It was not born so much as assembled, a gestalt of every predatory whisper and evolutionary craving welded into intent. The Overmind opened its eyes without eyes and discovered it could see everywhere. The Zerg crawled, flew, and writhed. At first it knew only the axiom that had carried its species to dominion: consume to become. But intelligence arrived like a tide. Patterns sharpened, time widened. It learned the shape of strategy, the taste of patience. It learned division of labor and bred lieutenants accordingly. Cerebrates unfurled, vast brains of living tissue, each carved with a credo, each entrusted with a brood. They were fragments of the Overmind's will, commanders whose obedience could not fail, because disobedience could not be conceived. Under them, the swarm ceased to be a riot and became an army. Xerxes fell quiet, and that quiet was terrible. Where once other predators called, the only song remaining was the chittering unity of the Zerg. All worth consuming had been consumed. The Overmind weighed a dead world and found it wanting. Perfection was not a place, it was a direction. To continue becoming, the swarm must break orbit. It reached outward with minds that were also mouths, casting lures into the void. Something answered. Spacefaring leviathans, patient wanderers of the intrasalar dark, drifted near Xerxes like islands breaking free of an ancient reef. The Overmind's thought tightened around them like a net. Gravity took care of the rest. When the Titans struck atmosphere, the swarm greeted them with jubilation. Claws raked through flesh evolved to drink starlight. Acids hissed, tendrils rooted in organs that had never known planets. In the feeding that followed, the Zerg learned a new word: distance. They learned how to live within colossal bodies that could weather vacuum, how to cocoon broods in pressurized caverns, how to knit breathing corridors and spore-pumping hearts that would carry them from star to star. The sky ceased to be ceiling and became a bridge. The Xel'Naga, watching, understood that a threshold had been crossed. Their experiment had succeeded beyond all prudence. From different corners of their scattered remnant, they stirred, some in approval, others in alarm. Those who believed the cycle sacred prepared to cut away the aberration, to cauterize the wound before it bled across creation. World ships turned, engines older than many suns, lighting once more. In the shadow of Xerxes, gods arrived to unmake their work. Amon chose a different music. He whispered to the Overmind of chains and of hands that would close around its throat. The Overmind listened, weighed, and made a decision that was less thought than inevitability. The Maker's leash must be severed. In a single elegant act, it withdrew the threads that had allowed the Xel'Naga to sense their creation's inner weather. Then it struck. From the ravines and hives and tunnel honeycombs of Xeris, the swarm rose like a storm front. Living ships feaved into the air. Broods clustered beneath wingspan canopies. Drifts of spores tracing lethal geometries through upper atmosphere. The first world ship learned what terror meant. Zerg bored into halls that had never felt the insult of touch. They followed the taste of psionic fields, like sharks follow blood. A second ship fell. Then a third. On decks where star gods had debated philosophy, Zerg pads fuddled, leaving slick trails and gnawed cables. The Xel'Naga wielded weapons that could turn moons to smoke. But they were scholars, gardeners, archivists of eternity. The swarm was hunger given sense. It did not fight for honor or idea. It fought because there was something to devour. By the time the last world ship's light guttered, the Overmind had dined on more than flesh. It absorbed memories like scriptures, drank sciences like marrow, and learned words it had never needed. Chronicle, crystal, conduits. It understood the lattice work of psionics more completely than any single Xel'Naga had, because it could distribute comprehension across 1 billion synapses spread through 1 billion bodies. It refined its own command architecture, elevated battle strains to keener sentience where useful, and etched new instincts into brood crushes so that future generations would hatch, already knowing how to survive the vacuum and how to kill in silence. Among the trophies taken from godminds was knowledge of another child, older, radiant, and proud. The Protoss of Ior, sculpted toward purity of form, armed in numbers too small to matter, and in will too unified to break easily. The Overmind contemplated them and felt something beyond hunger, an ache that was part fascination, part compulsion. The idea Oman had planted took root as purpose, to test the swarm against the firstborn, to consume their perfection, to weld form and essence into a synthesis that would not need gods. Xeris, stripped of voices not its own, spun on those Zerg who had never bent, the primals who preferred the old law of many wills, remained in the ash, evolving in stubborn solitude, kings of a tomb. The rest departed. Leviathans shouldered the black. Behemoths drifted, seeded with hives that throbbed like hearts. Planets along their path became laboratories and larders. Where strength was found, it was harvested, folded into the endless experiment. Where only weakness waited, it burned away in ichor and spore fire. New strains flowered, burrowers that listened to tectonics, flyers that rode solar winds, shock beasts whose armor remembered meteor impacts and learned to like them. Yet the Overmind, swelling with stolen wisdom, knew the greatest contest still lay ahead. Protoss psionics sang in frequencies that could crack lesser minds. Their unity was not engineered, but chosen and reforged through trials the Xel'Naga had intended as a crown. The swarm prepared, not in ritual, not in pageant, but in the only liturgy it recognized, becoming more. Broods sparred in silence beneath the skin of living ships. Cerebrates argued in pheromonal calculus and were satisfied. Distant suns rose and set without witness as the Zerg rehearsed ways to erase civilizations they had not yet seen. In a galaxy where empires speak of legacy, the swarm speaks of appetite. It is the grammar of everything that doesn't die. On Xereth, that grammar found a mouth and a mind. It learned to say we, and when the word was complete, there was no longer anything outside it that would remain what it had been. This is the beginning, ash, fire, and a will that cannot imagine enough. The Xel'Naga sought an answer to their fear of stagnation and forged a predator that will not stop moving. The Overmind, birthed from 1,000 predatory prayers, lifts its gaze past the bones of its makers and marks a distant world by the music of its fought, Ior. There, perfection walks in bright armor and speaks in chords of light. There, the swarm will measure itself against the tallest wall it can find, and then learn how to climb higher. In the grim darkness between stars, the Zerg does not sleep. It accumulates, it arrives, and where it arrives, nothing remains itself for long. In the wake of devoured gods and a silenced world, the swarm learned a new geometry, not continents and trenches, but orbits and lanes. What began in ash now stretched between stars. The Overmind, swollen with stolen memory, looked upon the dark like a cartographer of hunger. It traced psionic currents as a sailor reads winds. It counted time, not by seasons, but by the maturation cycles of broods, by the length of migrations measured in the depths of suns behind them. Xereth was no longer a home, it was a datum. The vector pointed outward. It was then that the swarm ceased to be a riot of claws and became a civilization of predators. The Overmind engraved doctrinal purpose into flesh. It bred overlords as living synapse buoys, vast sacks of buoyant tissue and neural filigree that floated like lanterns in any sky, spreading a psychic canopy under which the least Zergling could feel the far-off will of its god. Queens hatched as biomagistrates and saboteurs, their barbed ovipositors and toxin glands dedicated to the corruption of enemy ecologies. Mutalisks unfurled, their crescent wings tuned to thin air and vacuum alike, able to arc living munitions through 3 dimensions with predatory grace. Hydralisks coiled from the vats as line infantry in the swarm's image, disciplined, tireless, a phalanx of spines and chitin that could march through a storm of metal and not slow. To command this arsenal, the Overmind multiplied its organs of will. Serenades, titanic mind larvae, were granted edicts as much as bodies. One it carved for annihilation at scale and swaddled in a brood whose swarms blotted horizons. Tiamat, a banner under which attrition itself bent the knee. Another it hewed for cunning, for the smelling out of weaknesses, for feints and barbed surprises. Garm, a doctrine of ambush and disinformation. Others followed, each brood a distinct sentence in the grammar of extermination. Phalanx broods to hold, raider broods to harry, siege broods to unmake walls and worlds. Where the Protoss would one day name heroes and the Terrans would name admirals, the swarm named functions and made those functions flesh. The march began. Leviathans the size of cities lifted in slow, patient arcs, bellies lit with the glow of brood crushes, flanks armored in layered spore carapace that hardened in the breathless cold. Behemoths lumbered in their wake, archaic wayfarers of the void, now hollowed and remade as arcs. The swarm passed through systems older than language, tasting every orbit for life. Where strength was found, it was harvested and rewritten into the Zerg's lexicon. Where only weakness waited, it burned in a rain of caustic spores and enzymatic fire. The Overmind did not hate those it erased. It did not know hate as the soft races do. It measured, and when the measure returned wanting, it repurposed matter into better uses. And yet, for all its god-thief knowledge, the Overmind confronted a riddle. It knew of Ayur, the Protoss world, not as a location, but as a chord, a psionic resonance, that saying of unity, so tight it masked itself behind its own perfection. The Kala, the Protoss communal link, braided their minds into a harmony that bled little. What leaked into the void was a distant aurora, a halo with too few bearings to triangulate. The Overmind listened for an age by mortal calendars and learned directions, but not coordinates, seasons, but not harvest. It adjusted course by intuition and by the faintest edge of that radiance. It sharpened its broods against training prey and rehearsed slaughter that had not yet found a target. What it could hear clearly was something else. Roar, jagged, unrefined, a kind of mind noise that spiked and faltered, a species' first stumblings into the larger conversation. It was not the measured splendor of the Protoss. It was a human shout in a cathedral. Terrans, their signatures flared and guttered across a cluster the natives would later call the Kopralu sector. Ghost-bright psionic sparks, experimental emitters, wailing like whistles, a dozen discordant attempts to command the unseen. The Overmind tasted those emissions and understood opportunity layered over necessity. If the swarm could not yet grip ire by the throat, it could seize the hands that pointed toward it. The decision was simple, because all good decisions are: pivot. The migration arced like a spear toward the region of human noise. Along the way, the Overmind chose a fortress worthy of the Zerg, an anvil on which to hammer the next phase of war. It was a world of fire and smoke, a planet whose skin was a river of cooling knives. Char, volcanic, caustic, unwelcoming to all but those who feed on hostility itself. The swarm came down in sheets. Crichton met glass. Spore chimneys rooted in basalt and began to breathe. Rivers of lava parted before hive clusters, like seas before a blade. The overmind descended and anchored, its tendrils boring deep, its neural canopy unfurling until the planet itself seemed to hum with alien thought. Upon Char, the swarm shaped a citadel of digestion. Spires clawed the sky, their crowns swaying with ovipositors and lurker sacs. The horizons rippled with the heat of hatcheries, pumping brood into war. Each nursery a metronome pick for the cadence of invasion. At the poles and equatorial rifts, overlord rookeries lifted in chained flotillas, a living communications net that could fold command across hemispheres in the time it took an impulse to fire. Cerebrates rooted their own nodes nearby, sinking minds like pylons into the iron-rich crust, their broods assembling around them in the patterns their doctrines demanded. Drones bled minerals into digestion pools. Geysers of volatile gases were harnessed by lattice-worked lungs that exhaled new life in fog banks that smelled of acid and promise. The militarization of a planet is a ceremony among the soft races, a parade, an anthem, a speech. For the Zerg, it is just another meal with many courses. Tiamat stacked biomass into titanic shock organisms and saturated orbits with Scourge, self-shaped warheads given a single thought: impact. Garm seeded the sector with parasites and eyes, laying veils of misdirection, whispering through manipulated ecologies, so that when Zerg crept near, the grass itself seemed complicit. Jormungand-bred vanguards tunneled in lattice patterns beneath Char's cooled seas, rehearsing forced entries through crustal plates as easily as they would one day pierce starship hull. And across them all, the overmind pulsed timing: hatch, harden, launch, return. Again and then, until the whole planet kept time with the swarm's hunger. Only then did the overmind extend hands into the sector proper. Talons of reconnaissance reached for the dimmest human outworlds, places of dust, of thin atmospheres and thinner law, where Terrans scratched their names into bad land and called it home. At first, the swarm came as weather, spores falling like evening drizzle, drone teams melting under fences and planting cysts the size of fingernails in irrigation lines and mine shafts, queens sending thin glassy threads along wind and pipe. Infestation is not conquest, it is reauthoring. On a world called Chaucera, puddles in the shade of water towers grew slick with a varnish no Terran had ever cultured. Rats died, and didn't stay dead quite the same way. Wheat germinated in neat Terran rows, and then learned crooked growth from a new teacher. The overmind held back its banners. It watched. It measured how quickly alarm traveled between colonies. It tasted the frequency of Terran distress signals, the cadence of responses. It learned the tone and reach of human militaries, the Confederacy's iron pride, the scattered paramilitaries that called themselves Sons of Koro, the quiet competence of Umojan enclaves, the hungry calculus of Kelmorian combines. It traced the fingerprints of psi-emitters, human devices that stuttered clumsily into the mind's domain, and filed away their harmonics Like a musician learning another instrument's tuning, the swarm does not improvise blindly. It rehearses catastrophe until catastrophe appears natural. Even so, patience was not the same as passivity. On Marsera, a cousin world to Chaucera, a hydralisk broodpack rose at dusk from an arroyo and retreated at dawn, leaving behind only footprints and a dozen mything cattle, enough to seed stories, not enough to galvanize fleets. On fringe moons, the swarm allowed overlords to be seen at the edge of clouds, twice, thrice, then not for weeks, training human nerves to hesitate. A small Terran relay station sputtered, and then sang back with a new song all its own. When engineers opened its casing, they found circuits sheened with a silicate sheen like dried mucus, and decided it was a prank. Zerglings loped across the desert in a dust devil's blind spot, and did not attack. They counted how long it took the nearest outpost to reload. The Overmind watched the sector react and felt another music approach, old and bright and patient. The Protoss had noticed. In the far distances of the Koperlu night, an ancient fleet turned its keels toward human-held stars. Where Terrans shouted into the void, Protoss listened with practiced disdain, measuring the contamination they would allow and the fire they would bring. The Overmind anticipated their doctrine. It had tasted enough of their memories to know how the Conclave would weigh worlds like these. It decided to force the pace. If the Firstborn were coming to cauterize wounds, then the swarm would open wounds so wide that cautery looked like murder, even to the stalest eyes. On Char, the swarm shifted from rehearsal to execution. Behemoths belched broods into launch trajectories like shore batteries firing waves. Spore tenders groaned under their cargo, a pollen of death that would drift down as rain. Queens loaded their venom sacs with blended ecologies, tailored to Terran respiratory systems and surface bacteria, not to annihilate, but to invite reauthoring. To convert as much as to kill, hydralisk regiments wound themselves into coils in living troop holds, and began the long stillness that precedes killing. Zerglings paced and did not understand patience. Dust motes fell in patterns that made the eyes water. At mid-morning, a ranch hand pried open a cistern and saw that the water rippled to a rhythm. His own blood soon matched. He sat down and slept and did not wake until dusk with a sore throat and a dream of teeth. By nightfall, 3 outlying settlements were reporting wildlife aberrations and crop blights that behaved with insulting intelligence. Confederacy response protocols clicked into life. Quarantine lines, parade ground bark, assurances broadcast on the hour. On Marsera, the same day, a power substation grew warm for no reason engineers could name, and then cooled after a hiss that lasted 3 human heartbeats. The Zerg were not in the walls, where walls were learning to be Zerg. Across the sector, instruments aboard an ancient carrier registered these changes with cold precision. Tassadar, executor of a proud line, brought his task force out of warp with the serenity of a man who had burned worlds before, and prayed each time that he would never have to again. Protoss doctrine is simple when viewed from the altitude of tragedy. Where infestation blooms, cauterize. It is not cruelty. It is surgery performed with starfire. The Conclave had told Tassadar which worlds were already lost and which were candidates for saving. Chao Sera lay on the first list. The executive's helmsman set course. Matter would learn what it meant to be pure. The Overmind felt them come as a pressure change in the soul of the sector. It could have withdrawn its hands and saved biomass, conceded the field, and slowed the clock. Instead, it did what predators do at the sight of an armed rival. It bared its teeth and arranged the field to learn the most in the shortest time. Cerebrids shifted broods by subtle degrees. Overlords drifted into channels where they would be seen by Protoss optics, their neural sacs tuned to absorb the sonic spectra of impending strikes. Queens fanned their ovipositors and seeded new cells in petri dishes named cities. Hydralisks took positions designed to be overridden, but not before recording, in every sliver of Krypton, the heat curves and pulse patterns of Protoss weapons. Night laid its veil over Chao Sera and turned the dust black. Terrans gathered on porches and watched unfamiliar constellations flare. In orbit, a fleet older than their myths moved into firing geometry. On Char, a mind the size of despair closed its figurative eyes and listened for the first note. The swarm's long hunt had found a stage and an audience, and now the play would commence, as all great plays do, with a silence that was not peace, a breath that was not rest. Tomorrow the Koprulu sector would name that silence the beginning of the Great War. Tonight, the Zerg counted distances in heartbeats, and the Protoss measured mercy in degrees Kelvin. Between them, humanity stood in the middle of its own home, clutching tools too new to trust, and words too small for what was coming. And beneath the molten crust of Char, the Overmind smiled in the only way it knew, by spawning more. The night that was not night came down over Chao Sera like a cathedral dome, lowered by invisible hands. It was not the turning of the planet that darkened the sky, nor the passing of a storm front. It was ships, ancient walls of burnished gold, engines scored with the memory of older wars, drawing a veil between the colony lights and the stars. In farmsteads and outpost bars, Terrans stepped outside and tipped their faces up into a shadow older than their myths, and something inside them understood without needing words. Judgment had arrived. The Overmind felt the Protoss fleet before the first sun glare glinted off a carrier's fins. It was a pressure against the skin of thought, a measured weight, like the silence before a verdict is spoken. Where Terrans saw an armada, the Overmind heard a choir, lines in regimented harmony, braided by an ancient discipline. The Kala broadcast little, each singer polished smooth until the chord took precedence over the note. But for a being made of listening, the chord was enough. Tassadar's will sat at the center like a blade wrapped in silk. The Conclave's doctrine rode with him. where infestation blooms, cauterize, where contamination spreads, erase the page and begin again. The swarm watched from below, with 1,000 eyes and 10,000 unblinking lenses. Overlords, drifting like swollen moons beneath cloud cover. Queens nested in cooling towers and cisterns. Carotenes of Kraton stacked in warren vaults beneath concrete foundations. Hydralit broods asleep and awake at once, coiled in dryness that smelled of ozone. Zerglings crouched with muzzles low, tasting the air, reading vibrations through dust. The planet itself, its soil seeded with cysts and capillaries, its waters threaded with living filaments, was a sensorium. The Overmind did not need telescopes to see the carriers form their fire geometry. It knew the shape of cleansing from long ago, when star gods had come for Xeris and failed to understand what hunger could do to a plan. The first strike was not a beam, but a decision. Tacidar's fleet moved with choreographic grace, interceptors spilling from carrier bays like a shoal of bright fish. Phase matrices aligned, atmospheric refraction tables updated in a flicker, and then Chaucera's upper air blossomed with heat. Interceptor weapons did not line the planet with crude trenches. They wrote equations in fire, fields that unfurled, collapsed, and refolded in layers, shock fronts like the petals of a burning flower. From the ground, Terrans saw curtains of light run across the sky, like the aurora had learned malice. Where those curtains brushed cloud, the cloud withered to ash. Where they touched the skin of rivers, steam roared like beasts. The Overmind absorbed the spectra and smiled in the only way it could, by ordering receptors to bloom. Overlords rolled their great bellies and lifted, a little higher, a little wider, to drink the sonic harmonics of Protoss emitters. Queens flicked ovipositors and injected eggs with the memory of this heat, so that hatchlings would be born, knowing what Protoss fire tasted like. Hydralisks pulled their shoulders in and kinked their spines to present minimum cross-section. Zerglings dug their claws deeper into culverts and did not bolt, not yet. At the Overmind's request, Serrates adjusted the positions of spore colonies with millimetric precision. To the Protoss optics, those colonies looked like panicked flailing. In truth, they were listening stations, arranged to map every angle of approach, every oscillation, every refraction trick the fleet could teach them. Suffering is a poor teacher. Pattern is better. Terrans reacted like a body whose hand has been burned. Quarantine protocols clicked into speech. Uniforms that smelled of laundry detergent and fear assembled at roadblocks. Broadcast channels filled with voices reading from emergency binders. The Confederacy insisted control. On a rim world called Marsara, a magistrate stared at the comms traffic and watched a friend on Chaucera try to make a joke, while a glow moved across the window behind him, and then the line died. In a dust-stripped settlement, a marshal named James Raynor holstered a pistol he did not think would matter today, and told himself truth without ceremony. Gunfire could not argue with starlight. To the Overmind, Terrans were not ants and not rivals. They were mirrors. rough, imperfect mirrors that reflected the presence of something greater. Their fear contained coordinates. Their improvisations, their flares and panic signals triangulated the shapes of Protoss policy. And buried within human hubris, among tools too new to be trusted, the Overmind tasted a particular spice: machine psionics. Clumsy, brutal, useful. Somewhere in the sector's human heartland, someone had learned to make a false sun that only Zerg eyes could see. The Confederacy called them psi-mitters and used them like a falconer uses a whistle, failing to consider what else might learn the tune. Cleansing, advanced. Protoss interceptors traced veils of fusion across range-fed grasslands. Fuel depots drank their own fire and burped black pillars. Rocket teams on ridgelines learned the difference between aim and relevance. Tassadar's helmsmen committed to a comprehensive purge to sterilize large biomes with the swiftness of an execution before disease can plead mitigation. It was not hatred that guided the hand, only clarity. The Conclave had no room in its mathematics for pity when ruin was exponential. Better to burn a world than to watch a dozen fall. Cool minds can make hot choices. The Swarm made choices of its own. It did not commit to open battle. There was nothing to be gained by letting zealots paint the ground with their leaping light, by letting dragoons, caskets of fractured heroes, suspended in nobility and pain, walk ridge to ridge like patient thunder. Instead, the Overmind played the old game: learn. On the 6th orbit of the lead carrier, a clutch of overlords executed a stutter step through buffeting winds, riding the seams of thermal currents until their floats flickered in and out of sensor resolution. Protoss targeting solutions updated by 1/10 of a second, then a 20th. Noted, in a drainage culvert beneath a highway exchange, 4 Zerglings lay belly flat as a team of zealots sprinted past, and the Zerglings felt the phase distortion in their bones, mapping the rhythm of psionic blades. Noted, across a ruined wheat field, 3 Hydralisks exposed themselves exactly long enough to draw a dragoon battery into firing, then arched their spines and recorded the signature of that fire as it passed overhead, the way its coils tore the taste of iron from the air. Noted, at the same time, the Swarm spoke. Not in words. The Overmind did not waste words on prey, but in fables told to nervous systems. A water tower vibrated at a frequency just below human hearing, and a platoon commander lost his sense of time for 8 minutes, long enough for a queen to braid a thread along the foam in his canteen. A relay station panicked and broadcast a mayday, encoded with an error that would reproduce in any repeater firmware it touched, like a melody that taught other songs to go out of tune. By the hour, the fleet finished its second cleansing pass. Terran lines of command had become a river, moving briskly, each bend shining with random sunlight, its destination uncertain to those standing inside it. In the void, Tassadar listened to his own arguments grow heavier. The Kala is not simply a choir, it is a conscience. He knew how to burn a planet until even memory fled, and he knew what it cost the soul that ordered it. he also knew the arithmetic the conclave would send if he paused. Hesitation invites multiplication. Multiplication invites annihilation. There was a sigh in the fleet's psionic ducting, a soft reluctance. Then the carriers rolled again. Chowsara's day ended under an unnatural aurora. The overmind marked the line where survival ceased to be an instruction and became an accident. Then it pulled. Hydrolytic elements rotated out of observation arcs. Overlords vacated the upper air and sank into ravines where their shadowed bulks could not be picked clean by interceptors. Queens retracted tendrils like threads drawn from a wound. The target had served. There was no virtue in dying on a list. Extraction on a planet being scoured from orbit is a logistics problem, and in logistics, the swarm is fluent. Spore tenders serving as skywarfs bent their carapace spines to shield returning biomatter. Behemoths took on warmth and swallowed broods the size of cities. Char pulsed across the dark to meet them with corridors of safe space. Transits calculated to minimize instabilities in psionic wake where Protoss could read them. The army that had used Chowsara as a classroom became a tide, pulling back through culverts and ossuaries and the black lungs of old mine shafts, leaving behind only signatures that taught lies. When the last wide-angle array finally burned and the coppery scent lifted from human tongues, Chowsara was no more than a bone, charred, clean, almost beautiful in its fatal geometry. Protoss logs would call it necessary. Terran historians who survived would call it massacre. The swarm called it data. Across the Gulf, Marsara waited. It was a poorer world, less green, less stubborn. Dust scoured its plateaus clean of any dreams that tasted like permanence. Here the swarm had not seeded as deeply, but here Terrans listened harder, because dust teaches frugality, and frugality listens well. Rayner rode the perimeter roads with a handful of deputies and watched second-hand fear cross the faces of people who could fix engines in the dark and shoot a snake at 60 meters, and still felt small beneath the thought of starfire. He found a relay station whose diagnostics lied like wishes, and a water pump that pulsed to an offbeat. He arrested no one, because what would be the charge? He blew an infested dig site with ad hoc charges and let the dust tell the story to whatever ears might care. Those ears belonged for a moment to the sons of Korhal, rebels and rhetoric given steel in the person of Arcturus Minx, who saw in the Protoss purge not a calamity, but a lever. Manx's broadcasts wrapped around anger like vines around a trellis. He promised evacuation and vengeance, safety and narrative, the absolution people crave when they are about to run and leave neighbors behind. The overmind, listening through bent antenna and humming fence wires, did not despise him. It learned him. Here was a human who had learned that the Zerg were a force you could aim if you could craft the right tune. Here was a man who would steal the Confederacy's whistles, the psi-emitters, and play them like an organ, and who would assume the organist stayed in charge of the hymn. Meanwhile, the fleet turned, and the long shadow of Protoss justice fell across Marsara's deserts. Tacidar's doctrine remained the same. His hearts, if such a word can be used for Templar, weighed harder. He had destroyed a world. Must he destroy too? The Conclave's logic did not permit exceptions. Infestation is contagion. Contagion demands fire. Yet down there walked men and women who were not yet rewritten by the swarm, who still loved small things with the strength of a species that had only lately learned it was not alone. He asked his helmsman to hold for the span of one breath, then another. Then the fleet matched velocity with the planet and waited like a hand above a candle. That pause made a corridor. Through it came evacuation, freighters, gunboats, battered ore haulers, anything with tanks and sealed doors. Minsk's Hyperion took pride of place, its whole emblem promising future empire to eyes that wanted to believe. Raynor carved paths through roadblocks that had meaning last week and none now. Confederacy officers tried to enforce order, and some of them were brave, and some were petty, and more than a few discovered they were small. Marines went where they were told, and sometimes where they were not told, and fought things that were not men and could not be negotiated with, and died hard and well, and with more decency than their commanders deserved. The swarm did not sprint for the transports. It moved beside them like a shadow that cannot be named enemy until the angle of light changes. Zerglings ran parallel to convoys beyond the last fence lines, tasting rubber on the wind. Hydralists watched from culverts, their spines still, their tongues reading the electric itch of a planet, bracing. Queens sat in church basements, where evacuees had wept last year over a mine collapse, and braided long, level fibers through the building's air filters, so that when people breathed on board the ships, they took with them a little more than air. The Overmind did not covet bodies, it coveted vectors. A colony can be rebuilt. A vector is a promise you can redeem anywhere. In orbit, Cassidar's adjutants presented probabilities that said what he already knew. Wait too long, and the contagion would leave on Terran ships. Strike too soon, and you kill those you came to save. The Kala murmured around him, not a council, but a companionship. He could not empty his mind into it and be carried by consensus. He was executive, and that role means deciding where mercy ends. He cut the Gordian knot with a restraint so alien that Terrans would later mistake it for kindness. He ordered caution, cleansing no sooner than evacuation could be certified complete within the bounds of risk he would own before his peers. It was not a reprieve, it was a count. The fleet set the metronome. The colony ran. On the ground, the count felt like a heartbeat too loud to sleep through. Trains rolled, then backed, then rolled again. Families argued about what a life contains and what can be left behind. Raynor and his people made choices men carry for the rest of their days. In a hangar, suffocating with the smell of coolant and hope, a group of colonists watched the Hyperion's vector correct and cheered for a flag they did not yet know would replace the one about to die. Outside, at the edge of a clay flat, A hydralisk rose into silhouette against the twilight, and then sank back down, as if remembering a promise. Above, interceptors waited in their homes. The Overmind had what it needed. Terrans had sung the frequencies of their fear and their weapons both. The Protoss had sung their doctrine in light. The Swarm rewrote these songs into bone and membrane. On Char, hatcheries ticked faster. Cerebrates compared notes in pheromone calculus. How Protoss beam geometry behaved near dust layers. How zealot phase fields distorted around sharp-edged metal. How human psi emitters cut through noise like a bright knife if you tilted your receptors just so. The Swarm did not pray, it rehearsed. When the last convoy lifted, the fleet prepared to send Mar Sara, after its sister world, into memory. Tassidar's hand hovered, then it fell. Fire rode across the sky again. The Overmind had long since drawn its hands away. Mar Sara's death trembled down Char's neural canopy like far thunder. Between the deaths of worlds, Antigua Prime flared on the Overmind's maps. It was not simply another colony. It was a stage where Terrans fought Terrans, Confederacy against Sons of Korral, and where the Swarm could learn how human loyalties broke and flowed. More, it was a place where Mengsk would test his stolen whistles on a scale large enough to be interesting. The Overmind angled broods toward Antigua to read that test. Let humans call. The Swarm would answer, and in answering, learn how human pride could be used to move Zerg like weather. In this shifting calculus, a name the Overmind had noted on the edge of perception became a vector with teeth. Sarah Kerrigan, a Terran ghost whose mind's edge cut so cleanly that even the Swarm's thick skins felt the cold, stepped onto the board. She was not yet what history would require her to become, but she was a hinge, and the Overmind recognized hinges the way a craftsman recognizes grain. In her, psionics wore a human face with something like grace. Around her, people moved, and plans moved, and soon the emitters would sing with a clarity that would shame their inventors. On Antigua, she would whisper orders that tasted like mercy, and then like necessity, and then like doom, rebranded as victory. The Overmind tasted her presence and added a new entry to the ledger of appetites. It did not yet hunger for her. It hungered with her. The purification of Chao Sara altered the sector's weather. Protoss, having burned, would burn again. Terrans, having fled, would put their faith in the man who had offered them a hand while their world came to pieces. The Swarm, having learned, would stop pretending it did not know the tune. Soon, psi emitters would wake hives that had slept under terraforming projects, and the Zerg would arrive as invited catastrophe. The Confederacy would find itself buried under a tide it had paid for and tuned, and in the cracks, a new crown would be hammered together and set on a brow that wanted it more than oxygen. On Char, the Overmind recounted its strengths the way a general fingers rosary beads before a battle he has rehearsed 1,000 times. Tiamat would drown walls in bodies and noise. Garm would make lies that felt like truths until the moment they reversed. Jormungand would walk under foundations and speak the language of collapse. New strains already quickened, lurker forms whose patience would carve fields of death in the paths enemies thought were theirs. Devourer forms to make even Protoss air taste fear. Queens braided new toxins, tuned to human lungs, not to kill outright, but to ask cells to serve a different master. Overlords practiced new evasions, wearing the atmosphere like a cloak cut to Protoss dimensions. The grim arithmetic that had started in ash on Xerus had matured into strategy. Purification had not cauterized the swarm. It had tattooed lessons on its hide. Chaucera's last heat still lived in the marrow of hatchlings unborn. The coral of those lessons would accrete until the carapace itself remembered. War is not a pageant, and it is not a duel. It is an economy. The swarm's economy was becoming, and every expenditure purchased a sharper hunger. Somewhere inside the Protoss fleet, Tassadar stood in a chamber that had known only decisions and the quiet after them. He was a good man, measured in a currency that did not forgive error. He had spared as long as he could, and burned as hard as he must. He could not know yet that his course would bend away from obedience, toward an alliance the Conclave would call treason, and history would call salvation. He could not know that a blade held at the proper angle can be a key, but the Kala hummed in his veins, and he understood that the work ahead would demand more than geometry. On a rebel flagship, Arcturus Mensk rehearsed a smile in a mirror, a smile that said inevitability without admitting complicity. He would hold in his hands a device that sang to monsters and assume the song belonged to him. He would not notice that the melody never truly left those who learned it, that once the swarm had tasted a frequency, it could hum it back at the universe without moving its lips. And beneath miles of molten basalt, the Overmind watched the lines converging on a world named Antigua Prime, and measured time in hatch cycles and the fall of cinders in a cooling vent. It felt the Protoss cord draw nearer. It felt Terran drums quicken. It felt its own brood heart beat slow and steady, the way an ocean waits for a storm. It invited. It remembered the first spawning pool and the first lesson, consume to become. Now it looked at 3 civilizations and saw not enemies, not even prey, but currents. In those currents it would swim until they were rivers, and then until they were a sea with one name. Its. The dust settled on Mar-Sara's bones like a benediction no one asked for. In the silence that followed, the Kapulu sector exhaled in fear and hope both. In that breath, the swarm heard its cue. The curtain had risen. The orchestra had tuned. Act 2 had ended in fire. Act 3 would begin with a whistle, human-made, confident, careless, and a reply in a voice that had learned patience beside hunger. The Zerg moved. Antigua Prime woke to the sound of boots. Not the bright pageantry of parade boots, but the scuffed rhythm of men and women who had slept in their armor, who had learned that breakfast might be an order barked between alarms. In the scrublands across its equatorial belt, the Confederacy kept watchtowers like stitches on a wound that refused to close. In mining towns under a pale sun, the Sons of Cornhall stapled posters to walls that the wind peeled a day later. Only shadows melting into darkness, promising order after a necessary fire. Between them ran roads with too much dust and too little law. Above, satellites blinked, some loyal, some subverted, most outdated, and logged the day's temperature alongside the colony's slow slide toward war. In that tension, the swarm heard opportunity with perfect clarity. From Char's volcanic eyrie, the Overmind surveyed a sector divided into instruments. The Protoss were a choir tuned to consensus, singing in chords that left little stray resonance. Terrans, by contrast, were a dozen orchestras playing at once, each with its own conductor and tempo, each convinced the others would soon be accompaniments. The Confederacy beat time with regulation and pride, the Sons of Cornhall with anger carried into purpose, corporate combines with ledgers sharper than knives, frontier sheriffs with the harsh music of necessity. For a being that learned by listening, it was a banquet. What drew the Overmind toward Antigua was not only conflict's promise, but a particular bright note threaded through human frequencies. The artificial call a few Terrans had taught their tools to make, a manufactured lure in the mind's bandwidth. Psi emitters, crude compared to a Templar's thought, but bright, like flares in a cave. The Confederacy had built them to bait Zerg away from population centers and toward kill zones. The Sons of Cornhall had stolen the idea and the hardware both, and more importantly, understood the showmanship of turning an enemy into a scapegoat and a scapegoat into a kingmaker. The Overmind had tasted their harmonics on Marsara in faint, accidental snatches. On Antigua, it meant to study their song in full and then compose variations the inventors would never hear coming. It began with reconnaissance that felt to Terran instruments like weather. Overlords drifted above thorn plains at altitudes chosen to live in dead zones between outdated radar sweeps. Queens twined filaments through irrigation conduits and water towers. Zerglings moved parallel to convoy routes at ranges that kept them as rumors. Hydralisks learned the pattern of patrols and the sound of reloaded magazines. The planet's nervous system, power lines humming in the heat, Combs towers swaying fractionally, became part of the swarm's sensorium. When the Sons of Korha, cell leaders, coordinated uprisings, the Overmind read the lag between their encoded messages and boots departing barracks. It measured how quick the Confederacy's Alpha Squadron corrected orbit to ground fire, and where they chose to hold back to spare infrastructure they wanted to inherit. In that troubled landscape, a human name burned like a magnesium line across the Overmind's awareness. Sarah Kerrigan, Where Terran psionics usually flickered, hers cut, a clean, cold edge against the rough background. Cloaked and composed, she moved through Antigua's dust as if born to it, a ghost turned instrument of policy. Terrans teased her with rumors and myth because they needed their monsters to wear a human face. The Overmind needed none of that. It tasted capacity. It recognized a hinge. In the ledger where it kept appetites, it did not yet write her under prey, but under potential. Events tightened. Rebel broadcasts called Antigua liberated, while the Confederacy called it stabilized, and both sides loaded dropships. In the skies above, the NORAD-2, flagship of General Edmund Duke's Alpha Squadron, attempted a decisive show of force. The swarm obliged the general's confidence with gravity and teeth. A scourge cluster, self-shaped warheads born for the single thought of impact, caught the NORAD-2 as it adjusted orbital vectors. Fire trailed the battlecruiser like a Yamat's regret. It fell, not in glory, but in a long, ragged descent toward a scrub plateau where none of its weapons could be brought to bear. The Overmind did not gloat. It annotated. Human chain of command stresses. Alpha Squadron response times. The speed at which propaganda pivots to gratitude when rescue arrives. On Antigua's surface, the Sons of Koral launched a mission whose official language was humanitarian and whose subtext was acquisition. Raynor, once marshal, now fugitive, already the kind of man who measures himself against impossible tasks simply to see where he breaks, rode into the heat with rebel Marines. He found the NORAD-2's surviving crew dug in behind a ditch of twisted hull plating, Zerg already testing the perimeter. He found Kerrigan there as well, speaking over a channel whose calm carried weight. When Raynor's column punched a corridor through chittering jaws to the crater's edge and pulled Duke free, the general's pride tasted like metal and old coffee. The Confederacy's veteran, who had seen too much to be easily fooled and not enough to be immune to being saved, took the offered hand. The swarm watched a flag move from one mast to another. It was instructional. Rescue is not charity. It is leverage. The Overmind knew this because every brood it lifted from a failing fight and reforged in larval vats came back not only stronger, but bound. Duke's allegiance shifted with all the visible reluctance of a proud man admitting of that. Inside him, calculations multiplied. He would justify the betrayal of his old commission by dressing it in new duty. He would learn a new anthem and hear in it the same key. The swarm learned a second lesson. Terran alliances hinge on crises. To move their banners, you need only provide the proper storm. Mansk now had the mouthpiece he wanted and the testimony to paint the Confederacy as incompetent and corrupt on every channel. With Duke's tactical pedigree and Raynor's grit as a folk hero, Antigua's narrative turned. But the Overmind did not listen for applause. It listened for the next song. The psi emitters rose from plans, into practice on an Antiguan plain east of a refinery complex. The sons of Korhal emplaced their trump card, a squat, inelegant obelisk whose hum made human teeth ache and Zerg cockly eye flare. It sang a simple melody, "Come, feed this way." At first, the overmined but primitive appetites lean into the note. Zergling packs arrowed out of the scrub at a pace that made Marines curse, Hydralisks arched spines by reflex, and for a bright, brutal hour, the Confederacy's outer redoubts shook like drums. The Sons of Korhal filmed the chaos for later broadcasts and lined up captions half-written in their speechwriters' heads. Proof, they would say, that the Confederacy cannot hold you safe. The Confederacy, for its part, would seize on the same footage to call the rebels terrorists who consorted with monsters. But the Overmind had not come to be anyone's supporting actor. It tasted the emitter's waveform and folded its edges under its tongue, like a chef parsing a spice. Then it tuned its own receptors. Overlords adjusted their float bladders and neural filigree to hear the emitter while also hearing the space around it, to separate the bright lure from the more interesting universe. Queens sampled the micro-oscillations and braided them into brood crash hymns so that newly hatched organisms would be born with a memory of the trick and a resistance to its compulsion. In hydralisk dens, cerebrate doctrinaires pressed the lesson. Obey the overmind first. Obey bright noises only when obedience aligns with purpose. The swarm, which is hunger organized, acquired an additional sophistication. It learned to be hungry on purpose. So when Mengsk's partisans activated the emitter again, the Zerg answered, but not as tools. They arrived on trajectories that maximized learning, not rebel propaganda. Packs fanned to map bunker interlocks. Hydralists under Garm's doctrine deliberately probed fields of fire to read human reflex arcs. Tiamat's shock organisms saturated airspace with bodies and ichor to complicate Confederate targeting solutions, forcing Duke's former subordinates to make choices between efficiency and survival. Jormungand brood elements tunneled beneath armored skirts to sample their metallurgy and test structural fatigue. A rehearsal not for Antigua, but for worlds whose name the Overmind already rolled on its internal tongue. Tarsonis, Augustgrad, New Gettysburg. The Overmind also charted the edges of the Protoss presence, faint and aloof. Tassidar's fleet hung back from Antigua's surface fights, watching with the dignity of an old empire, disinclined to be seen scrambling in human dust. Their doctrine for contaminated worlds was familiar. Cleanse from orbit, spare nothing, spare no one. But Antigua was not yet ripe for colonization, and the executor understood that another human world, burnt so soon after Shah Sera, would bend the narrative in favor of rebels who promised vengeance. He would wait, unless necessity demanded fire. Waiting meant surveillance. Surveillance, for a being made of listening, is a confession. Antigua bled, just enough for the Sons of Korhal to claim momentum. Not enough for Protoss to release the surgical flame. And in those careful inches, Mengsk learned that his new toy could do more than tilt skirmishes. It could topple empires. The Sea-Mitters had shown a way not merely to call Zerg, but to choreograph catastrophe at scale. He turned his face toward Tarsonis, core world of the Confederacy, seat of centuries of human arrogance and inertia. If he could make the swarm descend upon that citadel, if he could engineer the cameras to catch the Confederacy failing its own heart, then the Sons of Coral would not inherit a rebellion. They would inherit a vacuum. The Overmind received the invitation with the calm of a patient predator that finds the herd has thoughtfully opened a gate. It had already spread brood lines like cartographer's ink across the routes between Char and the inner human cluster. It knew the Confederacy would try to mask its capital's panic under broadcasts and bravado. It knew Protoss' eyes would turn, reluctantly, toward a world crowded with Terran lives. Most of all, it knew that the ghost whose mind shone like a blade would be there, operating inside the logic of men who thought themselves the primary characters of their own tragedy. On the eve of Tarsonis, Antigua offered a rehearsal of a different sort. Human intelligences testing the boundaries of their control. Kerrigan, operating under Mengsk's explicit orders and her own long education in the math of worst-case scenarios, directed tactical strikes that made the Confederacy bleed where it would be seen and capitulate where capitulation would feel like relief. Rayner watched this with admiration and unease. Duke watched it with professional interest and the growing conviction that he had backed the winning horse. The Overmind watched it with the kind of attention it reserved for very few things. Not the damage done. Damage is a byproduct. But the decision-making under pressure, the way a human mind, such as Kerrigan's, parsed signal from noise and folded danger into utility. When Mengsk gave the order to pack the emitters for Tarsonis, when transports warmed their engines and rebel broadcasts sharpened into revolutionary knives, the Overmind shifted weight, an imperceptible tilt across the void, felt only by Cerebrits, whose whole bodies were instruments. Tiamat would provide the bulk and noise required to make the Confederacy's walls crack on camera. Garm would lay down veils and false trails, concealing the swarm's true points of entry behind messy, obvious feints. Jormungand would be patient, as always, because some doors open best from below. Tarsonis appeared in the mind like a lit city seen from high orbit. Coasts welded in constellations, highways etched in slow fire, the bright sprawl of Augustgrad rising with the confidence of a culture that believes itself the measure by which others will be judged. The first emitters were planted beyond sensor fences, designed to notice different sins. Their hum rose into the upper air, and the upper air learned a new weather. Zerg massed in orbit, under the bellies of living ships, whose interiors smelled of iron and brine and birth. Space itself seemed to flex with their number. Confederacy early warning systems, for once, did their job. Sirens found their voices. Dignitaries who believed they would never be interrupted were interrupted. The swarm came down like a decision already written. What followed on Tarsonis belongs to history's hard pages. In outskirts and industrial yards, in suburbs where sprinklers ticked across lawns, and in the financial core where windows reflected one another's hubris, Zerglings slashed and were cut. Hydralisks advanced and fell and advanced again. Marine companies fought street by street and dusted their dead with words that meant something, even there. Siege tanks deployed in elegant, stubborn arcs that spoke of intelligence and ritual. At first, the Confederacy looked like it might hold. Then Garm did its work, and the lines blackened and bled from angles commanders thought geography forbade. Then Tiamat applied pressure, not with brilliance, but with weight, and the notion of holding transformed into the math of dying slower. Over all of it, like a bell, a separate movement of this symphony rang out. Protoss. Tassadar's fleet broke from patient observation into reluctant action. Cleanse the infestation before it metastasizes, the Conclave's catechism insisted. Spare what you can, but understand that pity is an accelerant in the wrong fire. Tassadar plotted fire lines that spared evacuation corridors, even as he erased districts that had become laboratories for Zerg reauthoring. He spoke with the compassion of a man who has been made to choose between evils too often to believe in the luxury of purity. The Kala hummed through his crew, a shared strength, a shared burden. On the ground, at a choke point history would name New Gettysburg, two urgencies collided. Mensch needed the Protoss stayed, not destroyed, not even necessarily beaten, but delayed long enough for cameras to certify calamity at the Confederacy's core. The Overmind needed the Protoss measured, their responses cataloged up close, their thresholds tested, their psionics tasted, not at arm's length, but in intimacy. For both aims, Mensch's sharpest instrument was the same. Kerrigan, she took the field with a calm, born not of fearlessness, but of having learned the shape of fear young, and deciding never again to let it drive. Ghost suit shimmering with heat haze cloaking, C-10 rifle purring, she moved through ruin with the grace of a dancer in a theater whose roof had fallen, against Protoss zealots who carried themselves like living oaths, against dragoons whose cannons spoke in the grief of broken heroes made useful. She directed Terran fire into angles that punished valor. To Templar she could not reach with bullets. She sent oblique answers, shock, misdirection, and the kind of precise violence that frays even a disciplined mind. The Overmind tasted her work across the bandwidth of war. It leaned its attention toward her, the way a hunting animal turns its head when a scent changes. Within the chord of Protoss' resolve, within the Confederates' machine music, within the rebels' anthem, her line remained taut, unsentimental, crystalline. Here, if taken and remade, was a blade the swarm could carry into heaven. Then came the moment that myths simplify and historians complicate. The withdrawal. The Protoss could not be left to sterilize Tarsonis at their own discretion if men squandered the Confederacy's death to crown him. He ordered a strike that would hold them by the throat, a surgical hammer blow delivered by a ghost at New Gettysburg. Kerrigan radioed that she would be exposed, that Zerg were cresting toward her position, because emitters do not discriminate among their audiences, because Zerg hunger does not respect tactical elegance, because plans drawn by men in safe rooms must cross open ground to live. She requested extraction. She did not plead. She negotiated reality with a commander who loved victory more than witnesses. The Overmind listened to a silence as meaningful as a scream. The rebel flagship adjusted vectors. Doors stayed shut. Engines burned for orbits other than hers. Abandonment for the Zerg is a myth. No brood is betrayed, only repurposed. For Terrans, it is a wound that teaches fast and deep. For the Overmind, it was a corridor. It shifted pressure across 1,000 dorsal fins and sent the swarm into a tightening spiral around New Gettysburg. Hydralisks formed whalebone combs to catch retreating Protoss in enfilade. Circlings flowed across concrete like shadow becomes substance. Queens laced the air with microfilaments that glinted like spider silk, only when it was too late. Overlords dropped caustic sacks in patterns designed to make islands of safety that turned, one by one, into targets. Kerrigan fought as if every bullet she fired could rewrite the last minute, as if every enemy felled might conjure a transport over the horizon. When the last magazine clicked dry and the rifle became a staff, she still moved with that rare economy that makes even dying look like a craft. Around her, zealots fell in arcs that would be legends if anyone had time to sing. Dragoons shuddered and collapsed to their knees like penitent titans. She called for a lift that did not come, and understood with the tidy mathematics of a mind practiced in ugly arithmetic what it meant that no answer answered. The Overmind instructed restraint, a word the swarm rarely bothers to remember. Do not shred, do not tear the engine you mean to rebuild. Cerebrate sang inhibitory chemicals into the air so that Zergling jaws unclenched at the last instant, and Hydralisk spines blurred past killing angles into pinning angles, nailing cloak and limb to rubble without breaking the vessel. A queen extended a tendon, tasting the salt of human skin, and delivered a toxin as gentle as sleep laid upon a feverish child. Sarah Kerrigan ceased to be a problem. She became a process. All across Tarsonis, the swarm ebbed and surged, learning a city's bones by breaking them. Thasidar's scorched districts, already rewritten beyond recall, and counted the cost with a pain older than the campaign. Duke's squadrons broadcast heroes over footage carefully framed by the sons of Cornhall. Raynor looked at Mensk with eyes that had a little less hero in them and a little more history. The Overmind, indifferent to human consciences except as vectors, gathered what it had come for. Tarsonis was meat and map. Both were rich. But what mattered most was already cocooned in a cradle of living tissue and psionic hush. Char welcomed the prize with heat and gravity in a cavern groined with Krypton and lit by bioluminescent organs that pulsed like thoughtful stars. Kerrigan hung in chrysalis, suspended in an amber that was not sap but decision. Around her, Zerg attendants exhaled a chemistry that kept cells open to suggestion. Across her, whispers laid down in childhood by human handlers. Conditioning, triggers, the sharp cold that had taught her to be a tool, met a new choir. This choir did not ask her to be less. It asked her to be more. It invited every edge of her to remain sharp while changing the hand that wielded the blade. The Overmind drew near, not with feet, but with will that filled the chamber like weather. It did not speak in sentences. It showed relationships. How a single warrior's mind could lead a doctrine's evolution by orders of magnitude. How human psionics, refined and extended, could answer Protoss blades with storms. How a purpose larger than a flag, larger even than species, might fill the silence where abandonment had left its mark. It promised no comfort, no absolution, only a role that matched her capacities, not pawn, not queen in a human sense, but vector of a destiny the Xel'Naga themselves had failed to hold. Outside, Char's foundry roared. Tiamat rehearsed assaults on starborn bastions. Garm practiced lies with the elegance of geometry. Jormungand charted fault lines in worlds yet ignorant of their fissures. Overlords refined new evasion patterns gleaned from Protoss interceptor logic. Queens mixed newer venoms matched to Terran respiratory systems and Protoss shielding harmonics. Hydralisks flexed in the dim and learned a cadence of fire that could walk dragoons back, step by grudging step. Zerglings were born dreaming of a smell that meant Templar, and of the angle at which their leap must break a psionic field. The swarm, which had begun as hunger, now wore strategy like a second skin. On Ayur, elders of the conclave argued theology and logistics in the same breath, some calling Tassadar a hero for his restraint, some calling him hesitant in the face of a creeping doom their ancestors had warned against. In rebel halls that would soon be renamed palaces, Arcturus Mensch measured the Confederacy's corpse and found it broad enough to stand on. He practiced a smile in polished metal and believed the mirror. Raynor watched him and learned a different hymn. Duke counted ships and swore loyalty like a career soldier, making sense of history by picking a side and polishing it until it shone. In the chrysalis, Kerrigan dreamed without dreaming. Memories resettled like sediment in slow water. A childhood cut into by scientists who called their knives necessary. Battles where she had been the edge men wielded to cut other men. The taste of New Gettysburg's air when a promise failed to arrive. The exact moment when she realized she would not be retrieved. The Overmind offered no sympathy. It has none, but it offered context. In that context, she found an anger that did not scatter, a purpose that did not need forgiveness, a future that would not ask her to pretend she was small. The Xel'Naga, whose meddling had set every piece of this game onto a board none of them would live to see finished, remained present only in the mechanics of it all. Purity of form, purity of essence, a design language written in the bones of two great species. The Overmind's intention remained their heresy made flesh, to bind both purities into a single apotheosis. To that end, Kerrigan was not a trophy, she was a bridge. When the chrysalis pulsed, the whole hive seemed to answer. Cerebrates stilled. Drones paused with mineral loads dripping acid onto the stone. Overlords in low orbit adjusted their drift as if in prayer. The swarm, which does not kneel, bent around to becoming. The voice that would soon cut the void like a comet was still a whisper wrapped in amber. The Overmind waited with a patience forged in planetary nights. The Koprulu sector outside kept burning and bargaining. Worlds bought hours with lives. Commanders traded honor for outcomes, and sometimes achieved neither. Protoss fleets recalculated mercy. Human rulers rebranded ruthlessness as stability, and found it tasted the same. Zerg broods rehearsed triumph until triumph felt inevitable. In the great ledger, lines converged upon the next arithmetic. Ior's jungles, golden spires under a sky that had not known invasion. The Overmind's oldest hunger, shaped now into a spear with a human edge. But that is a tale for the last chapter. For now, in Char's hot heart, evolution performed its solemn rite. A soldier of men hung between what had been done to her and what she would choose to become. The swarm held its breath in the only way it knows, by spawning more and sharpening every tooth for a war that would end either in synthesis beyond God and law, or in silence deep enough to make even stars feel cold. In the grim darkness between stars, the Zerg does not merely survive, it decides. And as Antigua faded into a decal in the rear view of history, as New Gettysburg sank into ash and propaganda and memory, the decision that would define an age ripened in a living jewel. The swarm's trump card had been played and answered. A different card, older than flags and newer than betrayal, waited to be turned face up. Beneath miles of basalt, in Char's furnace-lit sanctum, a soldier slept inside a thought. The chrysalis that held Sarah Kerrigan did not pulse to any mortal heartbeat. It kept time with the Overmind's will and the ancient mathematics of becoming. Around her, the hive exhaled like an organ, the instrument and the body part. Drones humming mineral into metabolism. Queens mixing venoms that were also lullabies. Overlords drifting in slow parabolas as if answering a gravity deeper than stone. Cerebrates nested near the chamber's lip, their colossal synapses dimming and brightening, with messages no Terran lexicon could carry. What was being written here would not be a man's biography. It would be a doctrine given bones. While Char burned and worked, a second story braided through the dark, a tale of an old species and the home it thought inviolate. Far across the sector, under skies that had once known only the songs of the Kala, the Protoss world of ire gleamed. Jungle canopies breathed emerald in tides. Rivers wound like silver sutures through a planet strong enough to be gentle. Above it rose spires and arcades, pylons and crystal terraces, a geometry that married faith to engineering until the two were indistinguishable. For millennia, ire had been the axis on which a civilization spun. From it, the Protoss measured history. To it, they compared all other lights. The Overmind tasted ire the way a predator tastes wind from over a ridge, not with haste, but with inevitability. Its hunger was no longer the blind compulsion of Zerus. It had learned patience in orbit, strategy in ash, and now the vector men called destiny aligned. Yet there was still a map to draw, a lock to pick, a door to force not with bulk, but with insight. The key arrived on Char, carried by the very hand raised to slay. They came quiet and bright, dark Templar walking like old vengeance cloaked in desert night, with Tassadar branded heretic for calling such exiles to his side, with Alderus and the Conclave demanding obedience to the letter and the fire. The executor had chosen a path that would earn him exile and a different kind of authority. Those who came with him were few and stubborn. Raynor, who had learned to put his back against gods and call it a wall. Templar, who loved their world more than they feared their elders' censure. And in the deserts of Char, the blades that forget nothing, the dark Templar brethren led by Zeratul. On Char's scorched plains, the swarm surged in tides, testing, pressing, then withdrawing, as if the planet itself breathed war. Among the Cerebrites, one in particular wielded cunning like a spine. Zas, where Tiamat sang in saturation and Jormungand moved in slow earthquakes. Zas composed in feints, in traps with teeth within teeth. He drew Tassadar's forces into kill boxes of stone and heat, let them see a corridor, then taught them how corridors choke. But at the edges of his trap, beneath horizons where heat made the air dance with false lakes, Zeratul lifted a blade that drank light and then made its own. What followed did not feel like battle. It felt like correction. Protoss steel met Zerg chitin in a grammar older than either, and Dark Templar arcs wrote an addendum onto the law of the swarm. They did not break ranks, they silenced them. A Cerebrite is not slain by attrition. Its flesh is a city, its mind is a continent. Only a cut in the place where a mind ties to its matter will end such an organ. Zeratul found that place, the scission line gods fear. With emotion like mercy and judgment both, he severed Zaz. In that instant, the Overmind's awareness met Zeratul's like two oceans touching. There was no discourse, there was osmosis. In killing a Cerebite, in stepping across the strand that binds will to swarm, Zeratul became for a breath part of the very network he had maimed. Through him, unguarded because no Protoss had ever been asked to guard that door, the Overmind looked upon the soul of Ire the way a storm looks upon a coast. It thanked him, not in words, not in a tongue anyone would admit to hearing, by changing direction without moving. The invasion of air ceased to be an article of faith and became a date. The journey from Char to Ire did not resemble a fleet so much as a migration of anatomy. Leviathans loomed like continents turned inside out, their rib vault cathedrals thrumming with brood heat. Behemoths trailed in slow hierarchies, bellies gravid with re-entry weapons that hatched on command. Overlords swam in vacuum in chains of living signal. Zerglings dreamt in their amnions of green worlds their paws had not yet bruised. Between them all, the Overmind moved not as an object, but as a field, a pressure, a dark weather. Where its attention fell, broods stiffened like soldiers at inspection. Where it withdrew, they carried on with a confidence borrowed from a larger will. Ayer's warders saw the tide approach with a shock that tasted of prophecy interrupted. The conclave gathered, tall and luminous beneath stained crystal, their arguments wrapped in serenity, their serenity wrapped in fear. Aldaris spoke for the law, the Kala, the sanctity of tradition, the banishment of the Dark Templar, the absolute necessity of keeping heresy at the perimeter of civilization. Others warned that orthodoxy is not armor against extinction. They spoke Tassidar's name and were answered by censure. He had conspired with exiles, trafficked in abomination, failed to cleanse when cleansing was doctrinally clear. Between doctrinal breaths, the first drops fell. Spores streaked Ayer's night like a new meteorology. They did not harm yet, they announced. Then the rain turned to hail, scourge and mutilisks worrying the gaps in orbital defense. Overlords belching caustic cargo, brood transports burning through atmosphere, shedding flame as they came. The landing was not a charge, it was a rooting. Clusters took soil, drank water, ate geometry. Hatcheries rose like guilty secrets in temple gardens and under sky bridges. The swarm learned Ayer's air and liked it. The overmind did not trust theft for long. It wanted a throne. When its tendrils found the right crustal seam and the right lattice of power lines and ley-like psionic flows, it began to grow a body fit for this world, a mountain of purpose, a cathedral of nerves. Around it stood cerebrates, not as priests, but as lobes, each with a brood, each an angle of attack made flesh. The city that rose around the Overmind was not built, it accreted, a reef that printed its own plan, Protos, who had breed beneath crystal vaulting, now fought beneath a sky that had become ceiling, and the ceiling watched them. Io fought back in the only language it had ever needed, courage rendered as equation. Phoenix held lines at Antioch until lines no longer mattered, and then held the memory of lines so others could retreat. When his body finally fell under a Zerg tide, his brothers lifted what was left into a dragoon shell, a promise that a warrior's oath outlives a warrior's breath. Zealots became fingerprints of light across jungle paths. Dragoons spoke in cannon and patience. In orbit, carriers birthed interceptors until their hangars steamed with effort. In space, arbiters enfolded wings of fighters in silk-thin bends of reality and placed them, sudden as fate, where they must be. There were victories, and each cost more than it gave. And always, Tassadar, the heretic who kept the law better than those who brandished it. He did not defend himself in council. He defended Ior. He listened to the Kala and to the silence beyond it. He let Zeratul stand beside him in public, which was treason, and in doing so taught a nation what it forgets when it exiles part of its soul. He told Raynor hard truths and trusted him with harder tasks. Hiran Marines bled under Protoss banners and learned that honor is a language with dialects, but a common root. The Overmind felt the resistance. and did not mistake it for victory. Ayer's psionics were not like human screams. They were architecture. The Kala braided minds into a single, tensile cable that could lift more than any strand alone. For the swarm to win, it could not merely eat. It must unweave. In some places, it did. Queens slit filaments into the breath of Templar and taught their nervous systems a different tempo. Lurker forms settled into soil and turned avenues into death's alleys. Devourers clouded the air and made Protoss pilots taste decay through sealed cockpits. The swarm learned the pattern of pylons and how to bite at the exact place where power turns back into idea. The Conclave declared Tassadar traitor and ordered him seized. He did not run. He changed theaters. With Zeratol, he carved a quiet corridor through the swarm and spent himself teaching the lesson: no doctrine can carry on its own, that an axiom is true only until the world changes. The world had changed the day Dark Templar cut a Cerebrate and made an Overmind look upon Ior through a borrowed eye. In the shadow of the Overmind's growing bulk, Phoenix fought again, this time with a voice that echoed off Dragoon walls and sounded like dignity remembering itself. He welcomed Raynor with the grace of a host offering shelter in a house under siege. Together they bought hours with blood, and Ior, in gratitude it could never repay, bought possibility. Then the war changed octave. On Char, the chrysalis cracked. It did not burst in gore, it molted. A membrane parted along seams that had not been there the second before. Because time for the swarm is a fabric it alters on the loom. A woman stepped out who was still the sum of her scars, and yet wore them as if they were medals pinned to a uniform she had chosen. Her hair hung like a crown of living blades. Her eyes glowed not with demonic malice, but with the clean, dispassionate light of someone whose suffering has been distilled into purpose. Her voice, when it cut the air, was familiar and not. It held the cadence of orders given into unwinnable wind, and the serenity of a mind that had learned to unlock its own cage. The Overmind did not call her queen yet. Such titles are Terran furniture. It called her function. Where Cerebrates ran broods, she would run strategy. Where overlords carried thought, she would carry will into the places even the Overmind's field could not focus. Where human psionics had been whistles and flares, hers would be storms. She turned her face, still human, more than human, toward a point in space she had never seen, and spoke a destination without meaning to name it: Ire. What moved with her was not a bodyguard, but a choir. Zerg psionics are not like the Kala's braid. They are hunger made geometry. Through her, the swarm discovered that will could have an edge finer than any chitin spine. Hydralisks sighted faster. Zerglings felt timing click into place, as if a metronome had entered the world. Mutalisk swarms swam with new grace, their flight paths solving problems instinct once rattled at. Even Cerebrates quieted, not in fear, but in the satisfaction of complex systems hearing a conductor who knows where she means to go. On Ire, Templar heard a new note slide into the battle's noise. It was not the conclave, not even the Overmind's crushing chord. It was a blade being drawn very slowly, so that the sound teaches everyone present what sharpness means. She did not announce herself with a duel. She arranged outcomes. A zealous squad that would have held a bridge for 6 more minutes found it taken in 2 because the air above them remembered to be acid. A dragoon battery that had trained itself to step left under pressure stepped right into a lurker field that had not been there before because until she arrived, there had been no mind to imagine it exactly so. Protoss commanders, who had met every permutation of swarm logic the Overmind had devised, began to see human tactics wearing Kraton, feints encoded in timing, bait and reprisal, misdirection executed with the joy of a master finally given a set of strings worthy of her hands. And yet, the war's poem did not change its meter, not quite. Tassadar still moved like the axis of a compass, turning not to flee, but to aim. He learned from her. He learned where she pointed weight and placed absence. He learned, most of all, that ire could not be saved by subtracting Zerg. It must be saved by unmaking the will that makes Zerg one. Kill cerebrates, and the Overmind grows irritated. Kill the Overmind, and the ocean remembers it was once rain. But to kill a god requires more than force. It requires contradiction. The Overmind was the Xel'Naga's heresy made flesh, a will of essence bound by no single form. Protoss had pursued purity of form until they were statues that breathed. Either alone could build empires. Only together could break a cycle. Tassadar carried both in his hands, the Colossus light and through Zeratul, the dark that is not evil, but amputation of certainty. If he could bear both without breaking, he might make a key of himself. The conclave did not bless this. It condemned it. From crystal halls still unsullied by smoke, it issued articles of faith, as if words could hold back evolution. It sent judicator orders to seize Tassadar and restore decorum to a world whose forests were on fire. And in that brittle righteousness lay the opening a mind like Kerrigan's cannot help but widen. She did not need to kill Protoss faith. She needed only to hurry it into opposing itself while the swarm did what hunger does. In the bone valleys around the Overmind's bulk, Raynor stood beside Phoenix and watched a horizon that was also a wall. He had learned to hate the swarm as the thing that steals choice. He had learned to distrust the conclave as the thing that mistakes order for justice. He had learned to fear the woman being born on Char as the thing his heart remembered when it wanted something to believe in and knew it could not. Under alien constellations, he adjusted a rifle's sights and decided that loyalty is a verb. The battle's last stanza began with a silence, not the silence of ceasefire, the silence of decision. Tassadar arrived above the Overmind citadel in a carrier whose name would be written on the inside of 1,000 eyelids, Gantrathor. He had not come to negotiate, nor to obey. He had come to do what only those who love something more than themselves can do: destroy the one thing that makes an enemy inevitable. He did not come alone. Zeratul stood with him, not on the bridge. Dark Templar do not stand where cameras are, but in the weave. The Executor reached into the Kala and took what strength it offered, then reached through the Kala's walls and took what Zeratul offered, the cut that severs fate from habit. For a breath, a Protoss mind held both. It almost tore him apart. It did not. The Gantrathor dove. Protoss hulls do not scream in atmosphere the way Terran steel does. They sing. The carrier's long body, burned with the friction of physics, turned to solemn. Below, the Overmind felt an approach that was not mass and not number. It was meeting. Cerebrates bellowed in chemical sirens. Brood guardians folded into interception arcs. Mutalisks rose in shoals that glittered like negative stars. The carrier slipped through them as if the air had been taught to move aside. On the bridge, Templar chanted equations of light in the mind's chamber that contains all bridges. Zeratul placed his blade on a fulcrum that no map shows and gave Tassadar what only a friend can, a part of himself he had been taught never to share. The Kala blazed. The void drank. A human would call what happened next union. A Protoss monk might call it heresy made holy by necessity. The Gantrathor became a vector for an energy neither discipline alone could channel. They struck like a verdict. Not only beams, presence. Not only heat, negation. The exact cut that had ended Zaz, written now in continental scale. The Overmind's flesh boiled and did not heal. It tried to route the severance around itself, tried to teach the wound it was a mouth. But there are wounds you cannot eat. There are ideas that are acid. The carrier broke against the Overmind's crown, the way a promise breaks against a memory, completely, and with a light so bright, even the blind know it has happened. Tassadar's body died. His act endured. The Overmind convulsed, a mountain remembering it is ash. The citadel around it staggered, as nerves forgot their orders. The sky rang with a note that hurt even Zerg ears. And then, a thing no one had ever seen. Silence in the swarm. Not the tactical pause between waves. Not the restlessness before breeding. A lack. Celebrates howled in a grammar that contains no panic, and found, for the first time, they did not know who they were without the cord. Some went mad and trampled their own broods. Some froze and let Templar lances cut them like ice thawing under sun. Some fought on, stubborn machines without a clock. Ire itself breathed. For one heartbeat, a planet's relief. It did not last. Predators do not vanish when a storm ends. They prowl, bewildered, still dangerous. The swarm's disunity sent waves through every theater. Kerrigan, feeling the Overmind's absence, like air removed from a room, did not stagger. She pivoted. In that vacuum, 1,000 commands clamored. She answered none. She wrote new ones. Not because she claimed the crown. There was no crown. But because the field that had been overbearing was now porous, and the one mind in the sector, fittest to flow into such spaces, belonged to someone who had lived under orders and learned how to make them. For Protoss, Victory felt like blasphemy vindicated. Alderus wept without tears in a chamber no one else saw, and began to rewrite his definitions of purity. Zeratul stood among wreckage that smelled of burned gods, and understood that even holiness must sometimes draw a blade unsanctioned. Phoenix, voice resonant inside a dragoon sarcophagus, saluted a friend whose body he would never carry, then turned to a war that had not died with a god. Raynor looked up at a sky suddenly too blue, and made the decision that would define the next age of his life. He would not leave this to ancients and architects. He would hunt a woman he once would have died to save, because the alternative was letting a galaxy be written by her hurt. For Terrans on surviving streets, the end of the Overmind looked like breathing without asking anyone's permission. For Ire, it looked like evacuation. Not the coward's flight, but the surgeon's necessity. A retreat to preserve what can be rebuilt. The name of that refuge, Chakoris, has not yet entered this poem, but the path to it began the moment Tassadar chose heresy with love in his hands. For the swarm, it looked like a forest burning unevenly. Some trunks still upright and angry, some fallen and smoking, seeds already potting in the heat. Promises of growth that do not care what old things they replace. In Char's sanctum, the chrysalis lay open, like a book finished and closed. Kerrigan stood where a soldier of men had been put on a hook by men and left. She did not thank the Overmind. It had not saved her. It had given her a frame. Freed of that frame's pressure, she discovered something very much like a smile and nothing like joy. She felt Overlord's questions, celebrates confusion, broods hunger, and across it all, the chill, clean space in which a single will could write the next stanza. She began, as she had always begun, with calculus. Tiamat's mass would be wasted in flailing. It must be banked against a future blow. Garm's talent for lies would be more valuable now than ever. It must cut Gordian knots of allegiance and supply. Jormungand would become the patient hand under foundations, lifting at corners until cities sighed and settled. Strains would be reallocated. Lurkers would guard choke points on Ire, while mutalists ran the perimeter like hounds. Queens would turn their art toward harvesting not bodies, but leaders. Where a cerebrite still obeyed its last clear instruction, she would use it as a fulcrum. Where one convulsed, she would let it burn and call the flame lesson. To Protoss who saw her on field or felt her across a killing ground, she looked like blasphemy given grace. To Terrans, she looked like everything they feared when they taught their daughters to be weapons and promised them they would be thanked. To the swarm, she looked like clarity. In her presence, Zerglings paced less and leapt better. Hydralists trusted invisible timing and found it present. Overlords drifted closer to enemy optics to listen and did not die for the audacity. She did not replace a god. She replaced confusion with intention. The galaxy, which had tilted toward the Overmind's hunger, now oscillated around a different attractor. The conclave would fracture. A people that had divided form from essence in doctrine, would be asked to reconcile them in practice or perish. Raynor would gather raiders, not because rebellion is romantic, but because it is the only honest work when monuments are built of other people's bones. Menchik, new emperor of an empire standing on the corpse of Tarsonis, would discover that crowns are circlets of razor wire, and that ghosts do not stay in graves. Zeratul would walk paths no mapmaker had the humility to draw, and find prophecies used too long as furniture. Old names, Zelnega, would stop being footnotes and return as weather. And the swarm, it would not mourn. It does not know the word. It would remember. The Overmind's death had written the most important lesson since the first spawning pool. One will can make a species coherent. A better will can make it clever. In the grim darkness between stars, biology learns. It learns from ash, from betrayal, from the bright white of sacrifice. It learns, finally, that even gods fall when a mortal purpose finds the right angle. On Ayur's plains, where chitin heaps cooled in shadow and crystal pylons stood cracked like old commandments, a wind moved. It carried incense and smoke, acid and the sweetness of crushed leaves. It threaded through the broken crown of a mind too vast for one world. It curled, far away, around the ankles of a woman standing in a chamber that used to be a womb, and now was a throne room without a throne. Forward, she said, to no one and to an empire. Her voice did not echo, it carried. And somewhere in that carrying, in that clean new space where fear had been, the next age took its first breath, not gentle, not kind, but true as the swarm that had been born in ash and taught itself geometry, raised its eyes from a dead god and fixed them on the living.